There are things a man learns about land that cannot be written in any appraisal report. Raymond Calhoun knew this the way he knew the smell of rain coming over the eastern ridge before a single cloud had formed above it. He had been farming the same 340 acres in Callaway County, Kentucky, for 31 years. Not farming it the way some men farm land they have inherited and never truly claimed. Farming it the way a man farms ground he chose, ground he sacrificed for, ground he walked across every morning of his adult life, with the specific attention of someone who understood that the land was always telling him something, and that his job was to listen well enough to hear it. The kind of attention that does not announce itself and does not require an audience. The kind that shows up at 5:30 in the morning in every season, in the cold and in the heat, in the years when the rain came right, and in the years when it did not come at all, with the same steady willingness to read what the ground had to say and to act on what it said. He had bought the property in 1989, when he was 26 years old and newly married, with a down payment assembled from 3 years of working double shifts at a grain elevator in Paducah, and a loan from his wife's father that had taken 4 years to repay in full. The farmhouse had been built in 1921 and needed a new roof and new wiring and new plumbing, and Raymond had done most of it himself over the first 5 years, working evenings and weekends after the fields were done, learning as he went, the way men of that generation learned things they needed to know. Not from a manual, not from a contractor, from the material itself, from the problems that arose when you tried something one way and it did not work, from the solutions that followed when you tried something different, from the accumulation of small competencies that added up over 5 years of evening work and weekend work, to a farmhouse that was structurally sound and properly maintained, and that Raymond understood from the foundation up in the way you only understand a building you have worked on with your own hands. The land itself was what people in that part of Kentucky called mixed ground. The western fields, the ones that ran down toward the creek bottom, were rich alluvial soil that would grow corn in a wet year better than almost anything in the county. The eastern fields, the ones that climbed toward the ridge, were shallower and stonier, and better suited to hay and some tobacco in the years when Raymond kept a tobacco allotment. The middle ground, the 140 acres that ran between the creek fields and the ridge fields, was the complicated part. It had been logged twice before Raymond bought it, once in the 1940s and once in the early 1970s, and the soil profile in those sections was uneven in ways that Raymond had spent years learning to read. Some sections drained perfectly. Some sections held water 2 weeks longer than they should have after a wet spring. Some sections produced consistently. Some sections had years where they underperformed for reasons that Raymond had eventually traced to a shallow hardpan layer that formed at about 14 inches in the wetter zones, and that he had learned to break up with a subsoiler before primary tillage in those specific areas. Not all of them, just the sections where the hardpan was thick enough and wet enough to matter. He knew which ones. He had mapped them in the 6th notebook in 1996 after 3 consecutive springs of watching the pattern, and had updated the map in 2003 and again in 2011 when he ran soil probes across the whole middle field section systematically and found 2 areas the original map had missed. He had notebooks for all of it. Not the polished kind, the kind a working farmer keeps, which is to say spiral-bound composition books with field maps drawn in pencil on the inside covers and entries written in whatever hand a tired man manages at the end of a long day. He had 24 of them going back to 1991, the year he decided that he was forgetting things from one season to the next that he needed to remember. The notebooks recorded everything that the fields did across every season. Frost dates, first planting dates, the years the creek flooded and how far it came up and how long it took to recede and what condition the bottom fields were in when it went back down. The years the hardpan in the middle fields caused problems and the years it did not, and the specific preparation that made the difference. The dry years and what the ridge fields did in them, and the wet years and what the creek fields did in them. Equipment problems and how he solved them. Cover crop performance by field section, Soil test results recorded annually alongside the yield data from the same sections, so that the relationship between soil health and productivity was visible in the record across time, which was the only way that relationship ever became fully clear. 24 notebooks, 31 years of paying the right kind of attention to the same ground. Raymond's wife, Elaine, had kept the books for the farm operation since the beginning. She was not a woman who made a display of her competence, but she was competent in the specific way that farm wives of her generation were competent, which was completely and quietly, and without requiring acknowledgement. She managed the accounts and the tax filings and the equipment loan schedules and the crop insurance paperwork and the annual operating notes with the same steady attention that Raymond brought to the fields. They had 2 children, both grown now. A daughter in Louisville who worked in hospital administration and a son in Nashville who had tried farming for 4 years after college, decided it was not what he wanted, and was now in construction management. Raymond did not hold that against the boy. Farming had to choose you as much as you chose it. Not everyone heard the land the way Raymond heard it. Some people looked at a field and saw acres. Raymond looked at the same field and heard a conversation that had been going on for 31 years, with the same ground, in the same language, the language of soil temperature and moisture content and organic matter, and the particular way a stand of corn held its leaves in the afternoon heat when the roots were finding what they needed, and the different way it held them when they were not. The operation had been modestly profitable in most years, and genuinely profitable in a few good ones, and barely solvent in the bad ones. The bad ones had come in clusters, the way bad years in farming do. The drought years of 2012 and 2016, the flood year of 2019 when the creek came up in April and stayed up until mid-June, and Raymond lost the bottom fields entirely and replanted into a year that was already 2 months behind. The operating line of credit at First Callaway Bank had been a fact of Raymond's financial life for 20 years, extended and renewed each spring, drawn down through the season, paid back after harvest or carried forward when the year did not allow it. It was the standard structure of a farming operation that ran on seasonal cash flow, and Raymond had managed it the way he managed everything about the farm, with discipline and the understanding that the relationship between a farmer and his bank was a partnership that worked when both sides understood what they were working with. The relationship with the bank had been straightforward for most of those 20 years. Raymond knew the agricultural loan officer, a man named Dennis Pruitt, who had been at the bank since the early 1990s and who understood farming the way a man understands something he has spent 30 years watching from close range. Dennis knew Raymond's operation. He knew the land. He knew that a bad year on the Calhoun farm was a weather problem or a market problem, not a management problem, and he knew that because he had been to the farm multiple times across 20 years and had the kind of feel for it that you cannot get from a file, however thorough the file is. He had renewed Raymond's operating line without difficulty through both drought years and had worked with Raymond on a modified repayment schedule after 2019 without drama. That was the kind of banker a farmer needed, not one who would give away the bank's money without judgment. One who had enough knowledge of the specific operation to apply his judgment to the specific situation, rather than the general case. Dennis Pruitt retired in the spring of 2022. His replacement was a man named Carter Webb, 34 years old, recently relocated from a bank in Cincinnati, where he had worked in commercial real estate lending before a restructuring moved him into agricultural finance. He had completed a 2-week training program on agricultural lending and had been given a portfolio of farm accounts in Callaway County that he was managing with the specific confidence of a man whose education in a new field has been thorough enough to make him feel prepared and brief enough that he does not yet know what he does not know. This was not an unusual situation. It was, in fact, the standard situation when an institution with a long-established portfolio of specialized accounts replaces the specialist who built that portfolio with a generalist who has been briefed on the specialty. The briefing is accurate as far as it goes. What it cannot convey is the accumulated specific knowledge that the specialist built across 30 years of the same relationships. That knowledge retires with the specialist. The new person starts from the file. Raymond met Carter Webb in April of 2022 when he came in to renew the operating line for the season. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Webb had Raymond's file, which was extensive, and had read it with apparent care. He asked the questions that the training program had told him to ask. He was professionally courteous. Raymond answered the questions and described the season's plan and felt, driving home on the county road with the windows down and the smell of turned earth coming in from the fields on either side, that something about the meeting had been different from the Dennis Pruitt meetings in a way he could not immediately specify. He thought about it that evening on the porch and arrived at the answer before the sun went behind the ridge. Dennis Pruitt had known things about Raymond's farm that Raymond had not told him in any given meeting, because Dennis had accumulated them across 30 years of meetings and farm visits and conversations with other farmers in the county who knew Raymond's operation. Carter Webb had known only what was in the file, and the file, however thorough it was, did not contain the things that Dennis had known. It did not contain the understanding that the Calhoun bottom fields in a normal year were some of the most productive acres in the county. It did not contain the understanding that Raymond's middle field management had improved steadily across a decade of trial and learning. It did not contain the feel of what the Calhoun farm was, as distinct from what the numbers said it had done. It contained numbers and history and the formal record of a farming operation that had been in relationship with this bank for 2 decades. It did not contain knowledge. Knowledge was what Dennis Pruitt had. Carter Webb had the file. The operating line was approved. The season went forward. Raymond planted the bottom fields in early May when the soil temperature was right and the creek had been stable for 3 weeks. He planted the middle fields in the 2nd week of May after running the subsoiler through the sections he had marked in the previous autumn based on the probe readings he took every October. He planted the ridge fields last in the 3rd week of May, waiting for the soil on the upper sections to warm to the depth he needed because the ridge fields did not perform well when planted into cold ground, a thing he had learned in 1994 and recorded in the 2nd notebook and had not forgotten since. The whole planting sequence was choreographed across 6 weeks by knowledge that existed nowhere but in Raymond's 24 notebooks and in the 31 years of experience that made the notebooks useful rather than merely thorough. The 2022 season was decent, not exceptional. Corn prices were reasonable, hay prices were strong, and Raymond finished the year in a position where the operating line was substantially paid down by November, and the farm was carrying forward into 2023 in sound condition. The ridge timber had continued to develop. The cover crop program he had been running in the middle field since 2015 had produced another year of measurable organic matter improvement in the sections where the baseline had been lowest. The tile drainage in the creek fields had performed exactly as it had been performing since 2015, converting the formerly wet sections into reliably productive ground in a way that was visible in the yield data every single year since installation. In January of 2023, Raymond received a letter from First Callaway Bank informing him that his annual farm review had been scheduled for the 14th of February, and that the review would include a formal property appraisal as part of a portfolio reassessment the bank was conducting across its agricultural accounts. Raymond had been through property appraisals before. The last one had been in 2017 for a refinancing. The 2017 appraisal had come in at a number that Raymond had considered reasonable, reflecting the land values in Callaway County at the time and the condition of the improvements on the property. He had no particular concern about the 2023 appraisal. Land values in western Kentucky had been moving upward over the previous 3 years. He expected the number would be higher than 2017. He did not expect what arrived. The appraiser arrived on a Tuesday morning in late January. His name was Greg Solis, a licensed real estate appraiser who did agricultural and rural residential work across a 4-county area. He was thorough and professional. He walked the property with Raymond for about 2 hours, took soil samples from several locations, examined the outbuildings and equipment storage, reviewed the tile drainage maps that Raymond had drawn for the creek field sections, and asked a number of questions about the field history and management practices. Raymond answered them fully. He showed Greg the notebooks when Greg asked about historical productivity, opening the most recent 5 to show the yield records by field section going back to 2018. Greg looked at the notebooks with what Raymond read as genuine interest. He made several notes. He said he would have the appraisal report completed within 2 weeks. Raymond received the report on the 8th of February, 6 days before the scheduled bank review. He sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. The appraised value came in at $212,000. Raymond set the report down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked it up and read the methodology section again, carefully, with the same attention he brought to everything about his farm, looking for what was there rather than confirming what he expected. The appraisal had used a comparable sales approach, which was standard practice, comparing the Calhoun farm to 5 recent sales of similar-sized rural properties in Callaway and adjoining counties. Raymond recognized 3 of the 5 comparables. One was a property on the far side of the county that had been sold for subdivision development and had almost nothing in common with working cropland. One was a farm that had been in poor condition when it sold, with degraded outbuildings and fields that had been in continuous row crop production without rotation for over a decade, and showed the soil compaction and organic matter depletion that followed from that. One was a legitimate comparable, a working farm of similar size and general characteristics, that Raymond knew had sold at a price that reflected a difficult family circumstance rather than the market value of the land itself. The appraisal had not accounted for the productivity differential between the Calhoun bottom fields and the comparable properties, most of which did not have creek bottom ground of that quality. It had not accounted for the tile drainage investment Raymond had made in the creek fields over the previous 8 years, which had converted previously marginal wet areas into consistently productive ground. It had not accounted for the systematic soil management in the middle fields, the subsoiling program, the cover crop rotation, the measurable improvement in organic matter content that the soil tests documented year over year. It had valued the timber on the ridge property at standing timber prices for mixed hardwood, without noting the specific species composition, which Raymond knew from a timber cruise he had commissioned in 2018, was weighted toward black walnut and white oak at densities and maturity that made the ridge timber worth substantially more than the generic mixed hardwood number the appraisal had applied. The appraiser had walked the ridge with Raymond for 20 minutes. He had looked at trees. He had not identified them by species or measured their diameter or assessed their grade. He had seen hardwood timber on a hillside and applied a regional mixed hardwood price per board foot estimate. $212,000 for 340 acres of Callaway County farmland with creek bottom ground and established tile drainage and documented soil improvement and mature black walnut and white oak timber on the ridge. Raymond thought about calling Dennis Pruitt, and then remembered that Dennis was retired and living in Benton, and that the person he needed to talk to was Carter Webb. He called Carter Webb the next morning. He explained, methodically and without anger, the specific ways in which he believed the appraisal had undervalued the property. He described the tile drainage investment and what it had done to the productivity of the creek fields. He described the soil management program and the organic matter data from the soil tests and what the yield record showed in response to that management over 8 years. He described the timber composition on the ridge and the difference between mixed hardwood valuation and the actual species mix, which was weighted heavily toward black walnut and white oak, 2 of the most valuable hardwood species in the eastern United States, at a maturity and density that represented a timber asset of an entirely different order from what the appraisal had priced. Carter Webb listened. He said he understood Raymond's concerns. He said the appraisal had been conducted by a licensed professional using standard methodology. He said that the bank would take Raymond's input into consideration in the review meeting on the 14th. Raymond thanked him and hung up the phone and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the fields for a while. Looking at the ground, he had spent 31 years learning to read and understood that Carter Webb had heard his words and had not understood what he was being told, which was not the same thing. Hearing words and understanding what they mean about a specific piece of ground are two entirely different capacities. And the second one requires something that a 2-week agricultural lending training program does not provide. He went to the filing cabinet in the back room where Elaine kept the farm records, and he pulled out the folder that held the 2018 Timber Cruise Report and the soil test records going back to 2009, and the tile drainage installation receipts and the crop yield records by field section, and the drainage tile maps he had drawn himself showing the coverage pattern in the creek fields. He brought the folder to the kitchen table. He opened it and began making a list of what he was going to bring to the meeting on the 14th. Then he stopped. He thought about something his father had told him once, when Raymond was about 16 and had gotten into a dispute with a neighbor over a fence line. His father had said that before you bring a fight to someone else's table, you need to know what cards are on your side of it. And before you know what cards are on your side, you need to make sure you know what cards they are holding that you haven't seen yet. Raymond put down his pen. He called his daughter in Louisville. Her name was Patricia, and she had not followed her father into farming, but she had inherited his methodical temperament and had applied it to a career in healthcare administration that had given her, among other things, a detailed practical understanding of how institutions manage their relationships with the people who depended on them. He told her about the appraisal. He told her about the bank review. He read her the relevant sections of the appraisal report over the phone. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was her habit when she was thinking seriously about something. When he finished, she said 2 things needed to happen before the meeting on the 14th. First, get an independent appraisal from someone other than the person the bank used. Second, have someone look at whether the bank had any obligation to use a specific methodology given the nature of the loan agreement. Raymond had not thought about the second point. He asked Patricia what she meant. She said that agricultural lending in Kentucky was subject to certain state and federal guidelines regarding appraisal methodology, and that some of those guidelines included specific provisions for income-producing agricultural property that might require the appraiser to use an income approach, in addition to the comparable sales approach. She said she was not a lawyer and was not certain about the specifics, but that it was worth having someone look at before he walked into that meeting. She said she would make some calls. The following Monday, Raymond drove to Mayfield and met with an attorney named Susan Holt, who handled agricultural law and real estate matters across the western Kentucky region. He brought the appraisal report, the loan agreement, and the folder of farm records. He sat across from Susan Holt for an hour and a half and answered her questions and watched her read the documents he had brought with the close attention of someone who knows what she is looking at. When she finished, she set the appraisal report down and looked at Raymond. She said 2 things. First, she said the appraisal methodology had a significant problem. Raymond's loan agreement, which had been structured as an agricultural operating loan secured by real property, required under Kentucky administrative regulation that any appraisal conducted for the purpose of a collateral review on agricultural land exceeding a certain acreage threshold include an income capitalization approach in addition to the comparable sales approach. The Calhoun farm, at 340 acres, exceeded that threshold. The Solis appraisal had not included an income capitalization approach. It had used only comparable sales. This was not a minor procedural issue. It was a deficiency that potentially invalidated the appraisal for the purpose for which the bank was proposing to use it. Second, she said that she wanted to look at the timber situation more carefully. She asked Raymond for the 2018 Timber Cruise Report, which he had brought. She read it in the room while Raymond sat across from her. When she finished, she looked up and asked Raymond when he had last had a professional assessment of the ridge timber. Raymond said the 2018 cruise was the most recent formal one. though he walked the ridge regularly and had his own sense of how the timber had developed since then. Susan Holt asked him if he knew what black walnut timber of the quality and density described in the 2018 report was trading at in western Kentucky in early 2023. Raymond said he had a general idea. She said she wanted to get a current timber valuation before the meeting on the 14th, and that she would arrange for a licensed timber appraiser to contact Raymond directly. Raymond drove home that afternoon on the county road with the windows down and the February fields gray and bare on either side, and felt the particular clarity that comes when a situation that seemed simple and closed opens in an unexpected direction. The timber appraiser, a man named Harold Sims, who had been evaluating timber stands in western Kentucky for 28 years, came out to the Calhoun farm on the 9th of February, 5 days before the bank review. Raymond walked the ridge with Harold for 3 hours, while Harold measured and assessed and recorded in a way that Raymond recognized as the same kind of systematic attention he brought to his own field records. Harold identified trees by species and measured their diameter at breast height and assessed their grade based on the butt log characteristics and estimated their board foot yield using standard scaling methods and recorded all of it in a way that produced, at the end of 3 hours, an inventory of what was actually on the Calhoun Ridge. Species by species, diameter class by diameter class, grade by grade. Not a category, not mixed hardwood. What was actually there? When they came back down to the farmhouse, Harold sat at the kitchen table with his assessment sheets and ran the numbers while Raymond and Elaine sat across from him with coffee. When Harold finished, he turned the laptop screen so they could see it and told Raymond what the ridge timber was worth. Raymond looked at the number. Then he looked at Elaine. Elaine looked at the number and then at Raymond, and did not say anything, which was her way when something was significant enough to sit with for a moment before speaking about it. The ridge timber, 112 acres of mixed hardwood on the eastern slope of the Calhoun property, heavily weighted toward mature black walnut and white oak with a smaller component of cherry, had an assessed market value based on current timber prices in western Kentucky and the species composition and density documented in Harold's cruise of $418,000. The bank's appraisal had valued the same timber at $62,000 using generic mixed hardwood standing timber rates without species-specific assessment. The difference between what the bank had found and what Harold Sims had found on the same 112 acres of the same ridge was $356,000. Raymond thanked Harold Sims, paid his fee in full, and took the assessment report to the kitchen table that evening after dinner. He laid it next to the Solis appraisal and the soil test records and the tile drainage receipts and the income history from the farm operation. He read everything again, slowly, the way he read a field in early spring, looking for what was there rather than what he expected to find. Then he called Susan Holt and told her what Harold's assessment had found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted to revise the approach to the February 14th meeting entirely. Raymond asked her what she meant. She said that they were no longer going into that meeting to contest a low appraisal. They were going into that meeting with documentation that the bank's appraisal had undervalued the subject property by a margin that was not a matter of reasonable professional disagreement, but a matter of specific methodological deficiency and a species valuation error that was verifiable and substantial. She said that changed the nature of the conversation considerably. Raymond asked what that meant practically. Susan said it meant that the bank had a problem they did not yet know they had, and that how Raymond chose to handle the meeting would determine how that problem resolved. Raymond thought about what he wanted from the situation. He was not a man who was built for drawn-out institutional conflict. He had spent 31 years in the relationship between a farmer and his land, and the relationship between a farmer and his bank. And both of those relationships had worked best when they were founded on accurate mutual understanding of what was actually there. What he wanted was accurate mutual understanding. 340 acres of Kentucky farmland that was worth considerably more than $212,000, and that a 34-year-old loan officer from Cincinnati had been about to use a deficient appraisal to undervalue for the purpose of reassessing the collateral on a 31-year banking relationship that had never once resulted in a loss for First Callaway Bank. That was what he wanted addressed. Not punishment, not a confrontation, accuracy. He drove to the bank on the morning of February 14th with Susan Holt beside him and the folder of documents on the back seat and the composure of a man who has done his preparation and knows what he is carrying into the room. Carter Webb met them in the conference room with the Solis appraisal in front of him and Raymond's account file, and the professional readiness of a man who has scheduled this meeting and prepared for it and expects to manage it in the standard way. Susan Holt set the Harold Sims timber assessment on the table. She set the independent agricultural appraisal on the table beside it. She set a 2-page letter citing the specific Kentucky administrative regulation requiring income approach methodology for agricultural collateral appraisals of this type, with the relevant statutory language marked on the table beside that. She did not do any of this dramatically. She did it the way a person sets things on a table when the things speak for themselves and the speaking does not require assistance. Carter Webb looked at the documents. He picked up the timber assessment first and read the summary page. His expression changed in a way that he did not entirely succeed in keeping professional. He set it down and picked up the independent appraisal. He read the corrected summary value. He set that down and picked up the letter about the regulatory deficiency and read it through to the end. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Raymond. He said he thought they needed to schedule a follow-up meeting with the bank's regional agricultural director. Raymond looked at him steadily. He said that was fine. He said he had been farming that land for 31 years and would be farming it next month too. There was no threat in that. It was simply true. The regional agricultural director was a woman named Beverly Cross, 53 years old, 26 years in agricultural banking in Kentucky and Tennessee, the specific authority of someone who has seen most of the ways that agricultural lending can go wrong and has developed across those 26 years a finely calibrated sense for when a situation requires genuine resolution rather than institutional management. She came to Callaway County on the 1st of March. She did not come to the bank. She came to the farm. Raymond showed her everything. He walked her through the creek fields and explained the tile drainage system and what it had done for the productivity of the wet sections. He walked her through the middle fields and explained the subsoiling program and the cover crop rotation and what the soil test showed about organic matter improvement over the previous 8 years. He walked her up the ridge and let Harold Sims's timber assessment speak for what was there. He brought her back to the farmhouse and set the 24 notebooks on the kitchen table and opened them to the entries she asked about. Beverly Cross sat at Raymond's kitchen table for 2 hours. She asked questions and listened to the answers. She looked at the notebooks. She looked at the soil tests and the yield records by field section. At one point, she asked Raymond what his father had farmed. Raymond said his father had farmed 60 acres of tobacco and corn in Graves County. She asked how long his family had been in this part of Kentucky. Raymond said his grandfather had come to Graves County from Tennessee in 1931 and had farmed there until 1968, and that Raymond had grown up on his father's farm and had bought his own land when he was 26. Beverly Cross looked at him for a moment. Then she said the appraisal conducted in January was deficient in 2 material respects. The methodology did not comply with state requirements for agricultural collateral appraisals of this size. The timber valuation used generic category pricing rather than species-specific assessment. The bank would commission a corrected appraisal using compliant methodology and current species-specific timber data. During that time, no action would be taken on the collateral review. She also said she wanted to discuss the structure of the operating relationship going forward. Raymond said he would appreciate that. Beverly Cross finished her coffee and thanked Raymond for his time and drove back toward Paducah on the county road. The corrected appraisal arrived on the 28th of March. Raymond sat at the kitchen table and read it. Then he called Elaine in from the other room and showed it to her. The corrected appraised value of the Calhoun farm was $684,000. The methodology had included both a comparable sales approach with properly selected comparables and an income capitalization approach based on the productivity history documented in Raymond's field records and yield data. The timber had been assessed using current species-specific pricing for black walnut, white oak, and cherry in the western Kentucky market. The tile drainage investment had been credited in the improvement values. The soil management program had been reflected in the income approach through the yield trend data. $684,000 compared to the $212,000 the initial appraisal had produced, a difference of $472,000. Raymond looked at the number for a long time. He was not looking at it as a financial instrument. He was looking at it as an accounting of what 31 years of paying attention to the same ground was actually worth when someone took the time to understand what was there. In the weeks that followed, first Callaway Bank and Raymond worked out a revised operating agreement that included a lower interest rate reflecting the corrected collateral position, a modified review structure that incorporated income-based assessment alongside property valuation, and a formal arrangement for annual field visits by an agricultural specialist from the bank's regional office. Carter Webb requested a transfer back to Cincinnati 6 weeks after the March meeting. The person who took over the Calhoun account was a young woman named Dana Ferris, 29 years old, born in Marshall County, raised on her family's beef cattle operation, a degree in agricultural finance from Murray State University, and the specific quality of attention of someone who grew up around farming and knows the difference between land that is being farmed well and land that is being exhausted quietly. Her first act in managing Raymond's account was to ask if she could come out and walk the fields. Raymond said yes. Dana Ferris spent 4 hours at the Calhoun farm on a Tuesday in April, walking with Raymond through the creek fields and the middle fields and up the ridge, asking questions and listening to the answers in the way that people listen when they understand enough about what they are hearing to know what to ask next. She looked at 3 of the notebooks. She looked at the soil test data. She asked about the cover crop rotation and what Raymond had observed across the years he had been running it. She asked about the tile drainage pattern and whether he had considered extending it into the lower middle sections where drainage was still inconsistent in wet springs. Raymond looked at her when she asked that. He said that was the next project and he had been pricing it. Dana wrote something in her own notebook. On the drive back down from the ridge, she asked Raymond how long he planned to keep farming. He looked out across the fields, the creek bottom green, and even in the April light, the middle fields showing the regular stand that came from properly prepared ground. The ridge behind the house holding the timber that had been growing there since long before Raymond Calhoun was born, and that would still be growing there long after everyone in this conversation had gone. He said he planned to keep farming until he couldn't. Dana said she hoped the bank could be useful to him for that whole time. Raymond said that would depend on the bank understanding what it was working with. She said she understood that. Raymond thought she probably did. That spring, he planted the bottom fields on the 8th of May, when the soil temperature at 4 inches had held above 50 degrees for 5 consecutive days, the threshold he had identified in the 3rd notebook in 1993 as the condition that produced the best early establishment in the creek bottom ground. He planted the middle fields on the 13th, after running the subsoiler through the sections marked the previous October. He planted the ridge field hay ground in the last week of April, the cool season grasses going in, while the soil still held the moisture from March, the way they established best on the upper slopes. The season was a good one, not exceptional. Good. The kind of good that comes from doing things correctly in the right order, at the right time on ground you know well enough to read rather than just work. At the end of September, when the corn was off the bottom fields and in the bin and the hay was baled and stacked, and the ridge was holding its autumn color in the particular way that black walnut and white oak hold autumn color, which is later and richer and deeper than the surrounding hardwoods. Raymond sat on the porch in the evening and looked out across the farm in the long light. He thought about the two numbers, 212,000 and 684,000. The $472,000 difference between them. He thought about what that difference represented, which was not something that had appeared or disappeared between January and March. It had always been there, in the soil and the drainage and the timber, and the 31 years of notebooks, waiting for someone to take the time to understand what they were actually looking at. The Calhoun farm had a history that Raymond knew in pieces, the way you know the history of a place when you have lived there long enough to find it in layers. The farmhouse had been built by a family named Garrett in 1921, the year the price of tobacco in western Kentucky had been high enough that a man who farmed well and spent carefully could afford to build rather than rent. The Garretts had farmed the property for 22 years before selling in 1943 to a family named Adkins, and the Adkins family had farmed it for 31 years, exactly as long as Raymond had owned it at this point, and had sold in 1974 to a man named Porter, who had tried to convert most of it to cattle, had found the creek bottom fields too valuable to keep in pasture, and had ended up running a mixed operation that never worked as well as either a pure cropland operation or a pure cattle operation would have worked. Porter had sold in 1989 to Raymond, who had bought it for the cropland and had spent a year figuring out what the Porter cattle operation had done to the middle fields before he understood why the soil profile there was as uneven as it was. The compaction from years of cattle traffic on wet ground in the middle sections was still visible in the yield records from Raymond's first 5 years of farming those sections. It had taken until 1995 for the subsoiling and the rotation and the organic matter program to bring those sections to a baseline he considered acceptable. He knew all of this because he had asked. In his first year on the farm, when he was still learning what he had bought, he had driven to 3 different addresses in Callaway County to find former owners or their families and ask them what they knew about the land. The oldest person he spoke to was a woman named Clara Adkins, then 81 years old, who had grown up on the farm as a child and who remembered, in the precise way that very old people sometimes remember very specific things, that the north end of the creek bottom field used to hold water for a week after every hard rain, and that her father had tried putting a ditch through it in the 1950s, and that the ditch had helped, but not solved it. Raymond had stood in that same north end field that afternoon, with the old woman's words in his head, and had looked at the ground and understood that the drainage problem he had been watching for 1 year had been there for at least 40 years, and probably longer. He had planned the tile drainage program from that conversation, not from a survey, though the survey confirmed what Clara Adkins had told him from memory. He had installed the first section of tile drainage in the north end of the creek field in 1997, 12 years before the systematic installation that started in 2014 and 2015, and the 12 years between had been informative in ways that made the 2014 installation far more precise than it would have been without them. This was how knowledge about land worked, not as a document you received when you bought the property, not as a report a consultant produced after a season of observation, as something you assembled across years of paying attention to what the ground did and asking questions of everyone who had paid attention to it before you, and finding, in the aggregate of all that attention, a picture of the land that was more accurate than any individual person's knowledge alone. Raymond had never thought of this as unusual. He had thought of it as farming. The creek itself had a personality that the bottom fields reflected. Raymond had learned it the way he learned everything about the farm, by watching it in every condition across many seasons. The creek drained a watershed of roughly 12,000 acres, most of it cropland and timber, with the timber concentrated in the ridge areas and the cropland in the valley floors. In a normal year, the creek ran clear from June through October and turbid in the spring months and after significant rain events. In a wet year, the spring turbidity extended into June and sometimes into July. In the wet spring of 2019, the creek had run turbid for 4 consecutive months, and the sediment load in that year's flood had deposited a measurable layer of fine material on the bottom fields that had taken 2 seasons to incorporate into the topsoil profile. Raymond had noted it in the 15th notebook. Not as a complaint, as a record. The kind of event that happened once in a generation on the creek, that changed the bottom field soil profile in a specific way, and that a person farming those fields needed to understand when it happened. He had also noted in the 15th notebook, alongside the flood record, the observation that the sediment layer from the 2019 flood was of uniformly fine texture, which suggested its source was from the cropland sections of the watershed rather than the timber sections, and that the cropland contribution to the watershed's sediment load was something worth monitoring in subsequent years because it indicated that the farming practices upstream were not retaining topsoil at the rate that a well-managed watershed should retain it. He was not in a position to do anything about the farming practices of the 17 other operations that contributed to his watershed. He could observe and record, which was what he did. Beverly Cross had read that notebook entry on the day she came to the farm. She had read it, set the notebook down, and looked at Raymond for a moment before asking her next question. She did not say anything about the entry. But Raymond had seen her read it, and had seen what the reading did to her expression. The small shift that happens when a person encounters something that tells them more about the person who wrote it than the words alone contain. She had asked better questions after that entry than before it. Raymond had noticed. There was one other thing that the bank's appraisal had not captured, and that the corrected appraisal had addressed only partially. The farm had a spring. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that appeared in landscape descriptions of notable properties. A modest agricultural spring on the upper eastern boundary of the middle fields, at the point where the ridge geology met the field soil profile, that produced a consistent flow of water in all but the driest years, and that Raymond had been using for supplemental irrigation of the upper middle sections during drought stress periods since 2003. He had not installed a formal irrigation system. He had installed a gravity-fed distribution system, pipe and valve work he had done himself over 3 summers, that moved water from the spring to a series of distribution points across the upper middle sections at a flow rate that was not sufficient for full irrigation, but was precisely sufficient for drought stress mitigation in the critical grain fill period, which was the only period on the Calhoun farm when the difference between adequate soil moisture and mild moisture deficit consistently translated into measurable yield difference. The 2012 drought year, which had been severe enough to materially reduce yields across most of Callaway County, had reduced Raymond's middle field yields by 8%, compared to a county average reduction of 23%. The spring system had been the difference. Raymond had documented it in the 10th notebook in the dry summer of 2012, writing out the yield comparison by field section, and estimating what the spring system had been worth in that single season in dollar terms. He had written it not to congratulate himself, but to know what the system was actually worth, which he had found was a figure that justified the 3 summers of installation work by a considerable margin. The corrected appraisal had noted the spring and the distribution system, and had assigned a modest improvement value to the installed infrastructure, but had not fully accounted for the drought mitigation value that the spring provided to the overall farm income profile. Raymond had pointed this out to Susan Holt, who had noted it in the documentation she prepared for Beverly Cross. Beverly Cross had read the note and had discussed it with the appraiser who conducted the corrected assessment, and the revised income capitalization approach had incorporated a drought risk adjustment to the income projection that reflected, if not precisely the full value of the spring system, at least an acknowledgement that the Calhoun farm's income volatility in drought years was meaningfully lower than comparable properties without supplemental water access. It was a partial accounting. Raymond accepted it, Getting to an exact number for the drought mitigation value of a gravity-fed agricultural spring in the Upper Kentucky watershed would have required a modeling exercise that was beyond the scope of what the corrected appraisal could reasonably include. The direction was right. The full precision was not achievable in the time available. Raymond understood the difference between the perfect and the adequate, and had spent 31 years making decisions in the space between them. Dana Ferris had asked about the spring on her April field walk, on the way back down from the ridge when they passed the upper distribution valve that Raymond had installed in the summer of 2007. She had not been told about it. She had seen the pipe and the valve and asked what it was, and Raymond had explained the system and what it did and why he had built it and what it had done in drought years. Dana had stopped walking and stood there for a moment, looking at the valve and the distribution line that ran along the upper edge of the middle field section, and then had looked at Raymond and asked how the bank had valued it. Raymond told her about the drought risk adjustment in the corrected appraisal. She thought about that. Then she said that what she was looking at was not an improvement to a property. It was a risk management system that a thoughtful person had built over 3 summers from materials that probably cost less than $5,000 total, and that had demonstrably protected the farm's income in at least 2 major drought years. She said she was going to note it in her file in the way that reflected what it actually was. Raymond said that would be appreciated. He did not say that no one from the bank had ever asked about the spring in 31 years. He thought it, but he did not say it. There was no useful purpose served by saying it. The person standing next to him had asked, which was what mattered now. The timber on the ridge had its own history, distinct from the farm's cropping history, running on a longer timeline. Raymond had commissioned the 2018 timber cruise not because he intended to harvest, but because he had been watching the ridge for nearly 30 years and had formed a view about what was there and wanted to know if his view was accurate. Harold Sims's 2018 assessment had confirmed that it was, and had added several things Raymond had not known, including the presence of a stand of mature cherry in the northeast corner of the ridge that was of a quality and age that Harold had described as genuinely uncommon in a working farm context, the kind of cherry stand that typically survived only on land that had been in continuous timber management or had been left entirely alone, neither of which described the Calhoun Ridge, which Raymond had managed as a timber production block in a general sense, controlling invasive species and maintaining access without harvesting. The cherry had survived because Raymond had recognized it when it was young and had specifically avoided it in the 2 small selective cuts he had made in the 1990s to thin the overcrowded sections of the ridge and improve timber quality. He had recognized it not because he had studied timber management, but because his grandfather had shown him cherry trees when Raymond was 8 years old, and had told him that cherry was worth leaving alone until it was ready, and that ready took longer than most people were willing to wait. He had not thought of that conversation in 30 years when Harold Sims pointed to the northeast corner of the ridge and told him what was there. Some kinds of knowledge travel across generations in a single sentence, said once to a child who is paying enough attention to hold it. The 25th notebook was filling in the normal way. Raymond was in the second half of it by the following autumn, the entries for each month recording what the fields had done and what the weather had been, and what decisions had been made, and what outcomes had followed. The lower middle field drainage extension that went in during October and November of 2024 had its own section, with the installation dates and the pipe depth records and the valve locations drawn on the field map on the inside back cover. Raymond had noted beside the map the date he had first observed the drainage problem in those sections, which was the spring of 1991, his first spring on the farm. 33 years between observation and solution. Not because he had been inattentive or indecisive, but because the solution required infrastructure investment that had to wait for the financial position to support it, and because the infrastructure investment required knowing precisely where to put it, which required the 33 years of watching how the water moved, You could not have done the 2024 installation correctly in 1991 because you did not yet know what the 1991 installation had taught you by the time you reached 2024. This was also how farming worked. The knowledge and the capacity arrived together when they were ready and not before. Dana Ferris called in early November to ask how the installation had gone and whether there had been any complications. Raymond told her about one section where the tile depth had needed adjustment because the impermeable layer was shallower than the probe readings had suggested, and the contractor had caught it before proceeding rather than after, which was the value of using someone who had worked the Calhoun ground before. She listened and asked the right questions, and noted what he told her in the way that people note things they intend to use, rather than things they are recording to fulfill a procedural requirement. Raymond had come to regard the distinction as important, because he had spent 31 years around people who kept notes of both kinds and knew the difference on first encounter. The farm carried into 2025 with the drainage extension complete. The cover crop program entering its 10th year in the middle sections. The ridge timber another year closer to the harvest threshold that Raymond estimated at another 15 to 20 years at minimum for the dominant trees. And the spring system operating as it had operated since 2007. Raymond was 61. The farm ran on knowledge accumulated across 32 years of the same ground. He thought about what would happen to that knowledge eventually. The way a person thinks about large questions that do not have immediate practical answers. In the early morning before the day's demands arrived, and in the evening after they had receded. He thought about it in the way he thought about the cherry stand in the northeast corner of the ridge, which his grandfather had told him about when Raymond was 8 years old, and which Raymond had protected for 32 years, based on a single sentence from a man who had been gone for 40 years. Some knowledge found its way forward. Not all of it did. He had started saying some of the things in the notebooks out loud to Dana Ferris on her field visits, not as instruction and not as biography, but as the kind of explanation that accompanies a walk when the person walking with you is paying enough attention to ask what something means. She wrote things down. Her notebook was different from Raymond's, smaller and more structured. The notes organized in the categories that agricultural finance used, rather than the seasonal narrative that a farmer's notebook used. But the things she was writing were the right things, the things that described what the land was and how it worked and why. And that was what mattered about a record. The land rewards patience more reliably than it rewards urgency. Raymond had written that sentence in the first notebook in the winter of 1991, and had found it true in every year since. In the fields and in the timber, and in the spring system, and in the 32-year arc of a farming operation that had been nearly reduced to a $212,000 collateral line item by a methodology that could not measure what it did not know to look for. The patience to build knowledge across decades. The patience to let timber mature, past the point where most people would harvest it. The patience to wait for the financial position and the knowledge to arrive together before putting tile in ground that needed it. The patience to walk the same path every morning across 32 years and pay attention to what it showed you. He thought about his father's land in Graves County, sold after his father passed in 2004 to a developer who put a storage facility on it. He thought about what had been lost in that transaction, not the land itself, which was still there under the gravel and the metal, but the understanding of what it was and what it had been. He thought about how much of that kind of loss happened quietly, every year, in appraisal reports and bank reviews and collateral assessments conducted by people who were professional and credentialed and competent by the standards their training gave them, without understanding what their standards were not measuring. The number they put on the land was not dishonest. It was simply incomplete in a way that cost real farmers real money in the silence between what the methodology captured and what the land actually was. He was not finished. The 25th notebook was on the shelf. The spring would come again, and the fields would tell him what they had to say, and he would write it down the way he had always written it down. in the hand of a tired man at the end of a long day, in a spiral-bound composition book with a field map on the inside cover, building the record that no appraiser's methodology had found a way to fully value, and that no bank's file system had found a way to contain. The bank had called it worthless, not in those words, but in the only language that banks actually speak, which is numbers, and the number they had put on it had said, more plainly than any words, that they had looked at this land and seen what their methodology allowed them to see, and had missed nearly everything that was actually there. They had found out, not in a dramatic way, not in the way of stories where someone is humiliated in a room full of people, in the quiet, documentary way that the truth tends to emerge when someone who knows what they are looking at sits down with the evidence and does the work. $472,000 was the distance between what the bank had seen and what was actually there. Raymond had not needed that number to know what his land was worth. He had known it the way he knew his own hands, but it was useful to have the accounting. It confirmed what 31 years of paying attention already told him, which was that the land held more than most people understood, that the value was in the knowledge as much as the acres, and that the knowledge did not show up in any report that did not take the time to find it. He went inside. Elaine had dinner on the table. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the eastern ridge where the black walnut were holding their last color in the fading light, and thought that a man who pays 31 years of attention to the same ground deserves to have that attention understood for what it is. The 24th notebook was on the shelf in the back room. He would start the 25th in the morning. There were things about that land he had not yet written down, and a new season coming that would give him something more to say.